When I was a young boy, I was told a disturbing yet true story. A woman in our village had died, and her grief-stricken husband, who could not live without her, had taken the decision to bury his wife in his back garden. The chap was a lovely man, and he was a neighbour after all. And in fact, I used to walk past his home on a daily basis, walking past the grave of his wife with my dog. There was no headstone, just a planted rose marking the place where his wife was interred. Every day the mourning husband would have his breakfast next to the grave of his wife, in his back garden. 20 years on, that grave is still there. The husband's still alive, and yes, she's still buried in the back garden. But it got me thinking, what happens if you come to sell the house one day? Well, in Britain, you can legally bury anyone, your wife, husband, children, grandparents, or any human in the back garden of your house. But there are a few steps to do it. Before I get a few comments, this is purely an educational video, and the right to bury someone in a back garden of a house is protected by the Burials Laws Amendment Act of 1880. Ashes, of course, can be scattered anywhere. For example, I know of a family member who was scattering the ashes of a loved one from the Millennium Bridge over the River Thames in London, and as the family member tipped the ashes out of the urn, a passenger boat full of tourists passed under the bridge, and all the passengers looked as if they'd had a severe bout of dandruff. What a nightmare. But it is possible to be buried outside of a cemetery in your own back garden. This is of course very controversial, and many people believe that burial outside of consecrated ground is illegal, but technically it isn't. But for this you don't even need planning permission for a home burial. This is because, strangely, after death, a corpse is regarded as clinical waste, and the local authorities are more concerned that this would cause a hazardous incident, for example polluting the water table. But applications for the home burial need to be made with the local authorities and those managing cemetery services in the region. But there are some things that someone must consider. Firstly, you can't bury a body on common land or land owned by someone else. For example, who wants to be walking to their favourite takeaway on a Friday night and stumble upon Gladys from up the road's tombstone at the side of the road? Secondly, the authorities must consider if there is a risk environmentally caused by the burial, and for this, one of the reasons why it's not possible to bury someone in a back garden at times is because the private burials must be a specific distance away from the dwelling or a home, and of course if there is a public access to the property, it's likely the body would not be allowed to be buried in the garden. There are some regulations regarding burials, such as how deep a grave could be and should be, and it was once said, no coffin shall be buried in any grave without less than 30 inches of soil between the surface of the ground and the upper side of the coffin. But you don't even need a coffin for the burial at home, as there are no regulations regarding this. But the grave must be registered as a site of burial later. The strange thing is that the only thing that requires some form of planning permission is if someone creates some sort of grand mausoleum or monument to the dead. That's not what our neighbour did. He marked his wife's burial with a single rose, a flower, near to a bench. But I always thought, what happened if that man sold his house and moved? Would he have to exhume his wife, or would he have to declare that the garden is a graveyard? One estate agent who handled the sale of a house like this claimed in the listing that, please be aware this property is being sold by family members as part of the relative's estate. It was the deceased's wish to be buried in the garden, as he was born and died in the house. This wish has been carried out, and the property will be sold as is. You would certainly discourage your children not to play in the garden with spades. But what is surprising is that if someone did sell their house with their loved one in the back garden, the future owner of the house could apply to the Home Office to have the body exhumed and then buried elsewhere, and they could also refuse family rights to access the grave, as it is technically their land. But yes, in Britain it is legal to bury someone in the back garden of a house following death. Of course, there are obvious examples when this is not legal. Still today that woman's grave is there, as is her husband who lives in the house. The things people will do for love.